1.
Live from Muscat, this is The Late Show with Krishna.
Good evening, namaste, and welcome to The Late Show with me, Krishna Sanal, live from Muscat. It's 8 p.m. in the UK, 11 p.m. in Muscat, and 5 a.m. in Australia. So good morning, Australia. Today we have with us Sam Rogers, who happens to be a teacher, a poet, and we'll just get to her in just a second. Sam, I'm sending you an invite.
Live from Muscat, this is The Late Show with Krishna Sanal.
Sam Rogers, I can see that you are in the studio. I am sending you an invite. I hope you can see us. So if you click on the little telephone icon that shows up at the bottom of your phone, when you're looking at the screen, you might be able to call in, Sam. Right, so while Sam's trying to call in, I'm just going to quickly play the news, and then we will take it from there.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
This is your latest Teachers Talk Radio News with Gail Glenn. According to a report published by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, published as students are returning to class, despite £7 billion from the government, available funds in schools in England will be down 1 to 2% on 12 years ago by September. The report comes as schools endeavour to recover from the past 18 months of COVID disruption. The government's £1 billion tutoring catch-up scheme helps us find that sensible balance between protecting staff and students and ensuring education is not disrupted, he said. Keeping children in the classroom helps them catch up. It has given pupils real hands-on help to support them following the disruption caused by the pandemic. And we want to build on that success. So I'm delighted to be further expanding the National Tutoring Programme, he added. The government hopes its tutoring programme will support up to 6 million pupils over the next 3 years. Will support up to 6 million pupils over the next 3 years. In England earlier this year, Education Secretary Gavin Williamson launched a consultation of teachers, parents and education leaders after outlining his hopes to make the school day mobile free. Some schools have already implemented their own bans. Reepham High and Great Yarmouth Chartered Academy in Norfolk are 2 examples. Teaching unions and head teachers have dismissed Williamson's plans, accusing him of being out of touch with the reality in schools and colleges. Julie McCulloch, Director of Policy at Head Teachers Union ASCL, said, "Many already ask students to keep phones in their bags during the academic day, and others have positive policies in place that allow young people to make limited use of their phones to aid their learning. For other learners, a mobile phone is an essential safety measure." A new survey by the comparison website USwitch found that 60% of parents who took part supported a blanket ban on mobile phones, which is a rise from 49% before the pandemic. 3/4 of those asked believe that banning mobile phones would help stop their children from being distracted. Norfolk parents sharing their views on Eastern Daily Press's Facebook page drew a distinction between stopping use inside school and an outright ban on pupils bringing phones to school. Emily Kate said, "Children need them to travel to and from school safely, but I don't think they should be using them while there. Gary Starman said, rules need to be more consistent and transparent. Some schools actually actively encourage the use of phones at appropriate times in lessons to complete tasks and research. This has been your daily education news briefing.
Lovely. I can see that Sam is now in the studio, so I'm going to invite Sam to unmute. Sam, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Good evening.
Good evening, Sam. Are you sorted with the tech?
Yes, I think so. I think I should be all good now.
Perfect. So I was just telling the listeners that the person we have with us today is Samantha Rogers. She is a teacher, a poet, a writer. And I'm going to leave that introduction open because I can foresee that there's a lot more coming up from her end. So Sam, would you like to add to that introduction?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, hi everyone. My name is Samantha Rogers and I have been a teacher for 16 years, 14 of which I spent in the Middle East. And I have decided to spread my wings and fly, and I am trying my hand at being an author. I love poetry and writing. So I've decided to be very, very brave and go and follow my dreams and aim to hopefully inspire children to love poetry as much as I do.
And you've definitely made a great start here in the Middle East, Sam. For our listeners, if you would like to call in, please do. You can follow us on Teacher Talk Radio on Twitter or using the hashtag TT Radio. Sam, what led you into teaching in the first place?
Actually, I never really wanted to be a teacher, so I don't really have the traditional route of saying that I always wanted to teach. I actually wanted to be a journalist. Maybe that's where the writing passion has come from.
Right.
Things didn't really work out in that route. There were lots of other things going on at the time. And it basically was a case of I became a teaching assistant while I was actually doing my degree. I have a degree in politics. And somebody in the school actually said, have you ever considered being a teacher? Of which I was, no, definitely not. I want to be a journalist. Eventually, I then decided to do training with the Hamilton Trust while I was actually in a school. So once I finished my degree, I was able to start doing that, but that didn't work out for me very well. I had a feeling that I'd be better off going the more PGCE route. Then I went to Oxford Brookes, and the rest is history, really. So no, I did not go into teaching as my first love or passion. It kind of came to me, if that makes sense. So it fell into my lap, and yeah, I had a good 16 years at it. So I think it's quite a good choice.
Right, definitely. I've seen you teach, and so I can definitely say you've been very, very lucky to have you in the profession. How did you find making the switch from going from the UK to teaching internationally? What was that inspired by?
If I'm honest, it was inspired by a desire to travel, which I always wanted to do. I couldn't wait to actually also be a teacher so that I could travel. I remember many days when I'd be sitting in London looking at the Guardian and the different jobs available and Times Educational Supplement, and I always had a vision that I wanted to teach overseas. Obviously living in England all my life as well, I wanted to see something out, to try something new, and obviously teaching was also a very good vehicle of which to do that. Going overseas was not as easy as it seems, especially when I first moved over. I left England in 2006, and as much as I might have made it look easy, it's not easy, as I'm sure anybody who knows who has worked overseas, it's not easy to give up everything and leave everyone behind, especially if you don't know many people. But it was something that I think changed my life, to be honest with you. There are many life-changing moments we all have, but had I never taken that step and maybe, just tried to do something out of the box. I had so many people sort of trying to convince me not to go, but I also had a handful of people trying to tell me that I should go, because at the end of the day, if it didn't work out, I could always come back home. It's not like I was banished from the UK, but it isn't an easy thing to do. And especially, I'm sure, as many listeners would know, during COVID, especially when you're now, faced overseas and you couldn't get back home, that's when it starts to become really real that you are far away from your loved ones. And I don't mean just from COVID, even through any natural bereavement. I've worked, for so long overseas. I've seen so many of my colleagues, unfortunately, lose loved ones, and then that panic to try and get home, or they don't get home in time. So as much as it's been a great experience, it comes with a lot of downfalls that, you're not as close to your family and friends as you would like to be. But I still wouldn't change it for anything. I've had an amazing time.
Absolutely. As someone who's never left home, I've always lived with my family here, and especially the past year and a half, a lot of people do talk about how difficult it is, especially flying across countries and time zones. Some people I know have not been able to make it to their homes for over 2 years because they live in the other part of the world. And so, yeah, definitely a blessing to count if you manage to stay with your family. And if you don't and you're still able to get home, then that's great. Of all the places that you've worked at, Sam, which country did you enjoy the most?
Well, that's difficult because I obviously want to return to all of them. So I don't want to sort of sound like I'm giving one.
That's a very safe answer, Sam.
You know what? They've all had a different part in my journey. So I can't really pinpoint one over the other. If it comes from a writing perspective, it'd have to be Oman, because for me moving over to Oman in 2019, there was a lot of reflection in my own life as well. And the job also allowed me to probably pursue my writing without the additional pressures of being a classroom teacher, because my role in Oman was as the cover teacher. So I did not have the usual constraints, I would guess, that a regular class teacher would have, whether it's parents' meetings, the planning, writing reports, etc. Whereas I have been a year group leader, I have been a classroom teacher, I know the difference. So I would say Oman definitely from a writing perspective, the UAE from a growth perspective, because I spent 9 years teaching in the UAE and lots of different experiences, from working in Arabic schools, teaching English, and working in international schools. So that's where I guess the foundation for my overseas time was. And then in Qatar as well. Again, another system completely as well, but also very valuable. And also that's where I was a year leader. So that was a different dimension to my role. So I've had lots of different roles, but I would say all of them, if I was to put them together, because of all the people and the friends and things that I've met along the way and the experiences, it would be hard to put one above the other, because they all have that equal, weight when it comes to the experience it's given me and the lifelong friends that I've made as well. So yeah, I think that might be my diplomatic answer.
Yes, I can see that the political degree is kicking in.
There you go.
Right. So how different is it teaching in the UK and teaching internationally, just in terms of the teaching aspect?
I think it's huge, mainly because I remember when I was in NQT in 2004 and I worked in London, I was just overwhelmed by how much, just having to take on so much, not just all the subjects, but everything else that went with it. And I feel that, a lot of teachers who have gone overseas have said the same thing. There was a difference when I moved overseas. I felt I could teach again because I hadn't been there was so much paperwork, etc., and then trying to juggle so many things. I felt that to some extent it kind of weakened my teaching ability. And when I moved overseas, I think I became a better teacher because I had just slightly a bit more time to breathe. Because obviously, for some listeners who may not be aware, if you work overseas in many schools, you might only teach the main course subjects, whereas something like PE and a language and IT, etc., would be taught by a specialist, which I know they follow a lot in a lot of American elementary schools, because I've met a lot of Americans while I was overseas who seemed absolutely shocked that in the UK, we literally teach everything. There are no specialists to some extent in primary school. So I did find that a big shift. And I found that I was then able to really focus on the lessons a lot more, because I wasn't trying to juggle as many things. Because I think as much as teachers are exceptionally talented, we all have different skill sets. And even though, yes, we can teach every subject, I truly believe that there are certain subjects, if you've got real passion for it, there is a difference in the way that you teach that subject. So I know, for example, I love music, but I know a lot of teachers hate teaching music. I absolutely adore music. So that is something that I am, quite able to do. Not everyone has that. There might be someone who hates teaching PE, for example, but as a primary teacher, we don't really have that luxury in the UK. You teach everything. Well, I would assume most schools do, at least when I was still teaching. So I think that had a big difference in the way that I taught, but also classroom sizes. Classroom sizes in the UK, I'm not really sure where they stand at the moment, but I found them to just be sometimes just outrageous that, you know, we're expected to teach so many children in one class.
Right.
And having smaller classes, I think, is also more beneficial for the children, not just the teacher, because they get more of that teacher time. When you've got 30 plus children, that is very difficult to maintain standards, let alone to make sure that you're getting to every child in the class. So there were lots of different things, but obviously things that, you know, policy, etc., would have to change. I can't change that, but I know that it affected my teaching, and I saw the change in how I taught when I went overseas.
And regardless of which background you come from or what professions you were in before you came into teaching, a lot of us we carry all of those experiences into our classrooms, don't we?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of my jobs before, mainly, I'd done a mixture of jobs really, from, you know, retail and admin and all kinds of jobs. I think for me, one of the things that had helped me, and it's not necessarily for everyone, I was always around children anyway. You know, I have a lot of nieces, and then I had my son. So I was always around children and listened to their experiences from school, or things they liked or things they didn't like. And one of the things children always told me in my family were they couldn't relate to their teachers. I don't know if it's, you know, even when I think about school, our teachers seem very far removed from us. We didn't seem to have that relatability. There didn't seem to be too much fun. It was more about, you just came here to learn and I'm here to teach you. And there wasn't a bond. And I think if there's one thing I think, you know, that I've learned over the years, is having that engagement with the children first. Because if you have that relationship with children, I do think that has a big impact on how they learn, rather than you just standing at the front and I'm the adult, you're the child. And there just seems to be a gap sometimes between the way we are with children. So I feel that for your background can have a lot to do with then how you are as a teacher as well.
Yeah, and there's been a big shift, hasn't there, from being an authoritative teaching style to a more friendly approach now.
Definitely.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh no, definitely. I think, you know, I'm sure I can't be the only one. I've had so many people say to me before, when they'd ask me what I did for a living, they'd always say to me, "You don't look like a teacher," which I always wondered, what did a teacher, you know, what are we supposed to look like? But I think people are gauging that from their previous experiences when they were at school, maybe 20 years ago, and a teacher just having a complete, you know, there was just a different look, I think, or how they expected a teacher to look, as if to say that teachers can't be fun and teachers can't be modern, etc. And that is irrespective of age, by the way. But I don't know. I just feel at times that sometimes there has to be a balance, though. I think whenever I've had a class, my whole sort of philosophy on teaching is I am still in charge of the classroom. It's my responsibility. But I think you can still get a balance with children where you are relatable, but they know you're consistent and you're fair. But there has to still be some form of discipline in the classroom. I don't believe in, you know, me and the kids just suddenly we're just the best of friends. I've been put in the classroom for a reason to teach, but that doesn't mean I have to not be friendly with the children. I try to make my lessons and just my whole personality as fun as possible, because that's just how I am naturally anyway. So it'd be difficult for me to suddenly be anything else. I try to be fun. I have a lot of energy anyway, but maybe that's just me. But I do think that kind of, you know, shows in the way that the children are and the way they treat me as well.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about how you stumbled into poetry. Is that something you always wanted to do, or just by chance?
My dad would like to take all the credit. My dad used to be in a band, and so he used to play the guitar and the keyboard. So my dad's always written lyrics and things, which I started to do as well. So once I started to get into poetry, he has obviously taken 100% credit for any talent that I have. So that's
lovely.
Him. But no, I've always liked writing. I used to write a lot of songs, and because I was around music so much, I would write songs with the lyrics for them obviously in poetic verse, and I'd always have them, you know, formatted in sense of verses, the bridge, chorus. So anyone who knows much about music, if you look at lyrics, they're sort of set out in a certain way. So I was always doing that from young, and I always liked rhyming. I just could rhyme very, very easily, and I just didn't really see anything much of it other than I just liked writing. I never really had this vision at a young age that I wanted to be a writer of books. I wanted to write as a journalist in, you know, magazines and things like that. That's more where I thought I was heading towards. But I've always loved writing. English was always my favorite subject at school. So I just like language. So that's how I've stumbled into poetry.
Right. It reminds me of that quote that goes something like, there are no accidents, only encounters with destiny.
Oh, I definitely had an encounter.
So I can see that we have quite a few listeners coming into the studio now. Hello, you are listening to The Late Show, and we are talking to a poet, a writer, a teacher, Samantha Rogers. If you'd like to call in with a question or a comment, or if you would like to chat in the chat box, please do. We would love to hear from you. Sam, a lot of people shy away from doing the things that they want to. And there's usually a voice in their head that says, it's not important enough, or you're going to not, I mean, who's going to want to read your work? How did you survive all those internal critics and the imposter syndrome when you decided that this is what you wanted to do and you were going to try doing it out
Well,
there?
I haven't survived it fully yet because I'm still going through it. There are days when I think, what have I done? There are days that I probably criticize myself more than I should. I don't think that will ever go away. And I think if I ever got to a stage where I had no fear, I'd probably give up, because I think if you don't have fear in doing something, then you really shouldn't be doing it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I think for me, I always knew that I wanted to eventually put my poems into a book. I'd been, told from a lot of people before, why don't you try and put together a poetry book? I think there was a lot of self-doubt. I think to start anything where you could be criticized, I think there's always going to be that self kind of internal doubt. Am I good enough? Will people think it's any good? But then I think there was a part of me that just thought, well, I'm 50 next year for a start. And if I'm not going to do it now, when will I do it? I think you get to a stage in life where people's opinions of you, you're not really that bothered anymore. I've had, the guts to try and, come out of my comfort zone, put myself out for criticism. And there'll be some people that think my poems are great, and some people will think you should have stuck to teaching, and so on and so on. But as far as I'm concerned, the only person I need to kind of be better than is myself. And I just feel that with everything that's been going on in the world, especially with COVID, you just think to yourself, life could be very short. We don't know what's around the corner. And I would much rather have tried than not try and live in some kind of regret, because you can't get time back. There's a saying that people always say to me, there's only one appointment you can never be late for, which is death. And so for me, I see no point in worrying about things that I can't change. I can, just try to be the best that I can be. And I'm going to have a go at it, which is what I'm doing. But I don't want anyone to believe that I've just, run into this journey and there's no fear. There's still fear. Even today, sometimes I'm sitting here thinking, as I look out of the window and I can no longer see the beach of in Muscat where I lived, I'm thinking, have I made the right choice? But, time will tell. The right choice is the fact that I'm doing it. So, yeah.
We have someone trying to call in. I'm just going to invite her. Oops, she's decided. Okay, Dimple, I'm not sure if you still want to call in. Dimple's left us a message. She says, I am new to this. I have published one podcast. No one has heard it. It's weird. Dimple, I completely understand how you feel, but it's just one podcast. And you might think that no one's heard it, but then here you go. You've come on live radio. You've told us about it. So you never know. You might get a lot of clicks now. Do tell us what your podcast is about. You've also written that your name is Dimple and you are from India. Yes, Dimple, if you would like to tell us more about your podcast, this might be a platform. We have a few listeners and you might want to share what it's about. Sam, you sound like someone who's very fond of quotes, because I've just heard you say a few things that have really, really stuck to me. Things like, just like the destiny thing, and there's only one appointment you can't be late for. Is that something you try to incorporate into your everyday life? Quotations, quotes that inspire?
Definitely. I mean, I've got one at the moment, a friend of mine, because So a friend of mine for my birthday bought me a lovely plaque, and I do look at this every day, especially as I'm suffering at the moment in the cold in the UK. And it simply says, suffer now and live the rest of your life as a champion. So I see that as part of my daily I read that every morning when I look out and I can't see the sunshine, which in the UK seems to have disappeared completely. So it just makes me think it might not be working straight away. Things aren't meant to happen straight away, but I do believe in having lots of quotes around me. And I think that could even be applicable to the lady that called in. Is it Dimples?
Yes, Dimple.
Yeah, because I could give her so many stories of things that haven't worked out for me on this journey. But if I gave up at the first hurdle, then I really wouldn't be the person I am today. She just has to persevere. It's never going to be easy. And I think there's another one they always say, if it was that easy, everyone would be doing it. So perseverance.
There you go, Dimple. Dimple is still with us. She says, so it was my first podcast. I talked about how social media is a friend and a foe. Thank you for responding. It means a lot. You are so kind. Dimple, no problems at all. You've written about how social media affects our life. And yes, especially in these times, it does affect our life. If you can tell us what your podcast is called, Dimple, like what is your name? What should we type in? Just search for your podcast. That would be great. Right. Sam, you have written a couple of books, some poems and some stories. Tell us how your first book happened.
Wow. In my previous school in Qatar, every year we would have a poetry competition. And I loved that because what would happen was every class from about year 2 to about year 6, they would recite a poem. That could be a poem of their choice. They didn't have to write it. It was all about performance, which is something I think a lot of schools don't do enough of, which are things like drama activities. I know that has a lot to do with, constraints of the curriculum, but I think it's an area that is so underused. And whenever I've worked with children and we've done performance poetry, the children have absolutely loved it. And even children that are quite shy, because we do it as a class, so maybe a group, would recite one verse and so on and so on. They've absolutely loved it. So I for the 2 years that we had we did it for 3 years actually. For the 2 of the years, I wrote the poem for our children, my class to perform, and they loved it. And I always found the children really liked my poems. And when we used to have a lot of visiting authors to the school, I remember speaking to one of the authors, and he always said to me, write poems for your class, and if they like it, then you're on the right path, basically. So that's what I kept doing. So I then thought to myself, I'm actually going to put some of these into a book. Why not? I mean, what's the worst that can happen? So then obviously when COVID appeared last year, obviously we had a lot of time at home on our own. So I had a pact with another colleague of mine. Her pact was that if we were going online, that she would use lots of time, obviously because we couldn't go anywhere because of lockdown, to lose weight. And she'd actually challenged me and said, you should be able to finish a book of poetry. At the time, I thought no problem whatsoever, but I don't know if it was because of emotional stress, because of what was going on in isolation. For about a month, I couldn't write anything at all. And I felt so defeated because I just thought, now that I've got all this time on my hands, I should be able to write. But eventually it did come back, and I decided to put all my poems into a book, which is called Cool Rhymes at School Time. And the main idea of those poems is I would hope that they'd be used for performance, because I know the benefits, even in the classes that I've taught, when children perform poetry, there's such a celebration of their voice and the way that they interpret your poems. I love to hear children read poems, even if they're not mine, because they sort of become someone else. It's like acting to some extent.
Yes.
And it's amazing to see, like I said, very quiet children suddenly become, very animated on the stage. And I just think it's something that a lot of schools should do more of.
Definitely. And on your website, nubianamedia.com, you have featured quite a few students or children who are performing your poems.
Oh, yeah, that's the best for me. I mean, I can read them, day in, day out, but obviously it's so much nicer when you hear a child read your poem. It's rewarding, but it's the sound that I want to hear, because obviously I'm writing from a child's perspective. So my book, Cool Rhymes at School Time, is predominantly about poems about the school experience. And so it's nice to hear a child's voice. It always sounds so much better when a child reads it. So that's what I would love to be able to promote more, is more time in schools for us to spend, on speaking activities and performance, because I think that it's very underused. And I think there are a lot of children who, for example, may not be as academic as others, but they shine in so many other areas, whether it's, the arts, etc. But we don't really focus on that a lot. We are very focused on the core subjects, and it actually then, I think, alienates a lot of children from a much richer learning experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a listener who says, hi, I'm SJ, listening from Seattle, USA. Hello, SJ. It's lovely to be able to communicate with you. What time is it in Seattle, SJ? let us know in the chat box. Sam, coming back to what you said about not performance poetry not being as encouraged as it could be. What's your tip to schools and families to get children to, or let's say to motivate them to do more of these things?
I think number one, make the time. There is enough time for everything. I just feel at times the curriculum is there for a reason, but I don't think that needs to be followed, every single moment of the day. If we can make time for other things, then why can't we make time for things like a poetry day, or even a celebration of poetry, which is what we did in our old school. And what I loved about the way we did it for that whole week, we used that as our English lesson. So when the children were actually, practicing the poem, we used the whole week of English. We were allowed to have that whole week off. So it does depend, obviously, on management if they will allow for things like that. Our school was very, very, big on performance. And, especially we had a lot of children where English was a second language. So being able to get them to perform was amazing for their speaking skills, their confidence. So it does, you've got to balance it, with other demands of the curriculum. You can actually get so much more from a week of poetry, probably, especially from a performance point of view, than you would if you were sticking to, I don't know, let's say you were doing myths that week. You could also incorporate that as well. There's a way that you can incorporate poems in the curriculum without it being a standalone subject, which I find in most schools, it usually is a standalone section. And then we don't, revisit again for about another 2 months or so, or unless it's National Poetry Day, things like that. And I think it's
we tend to give it maybe a week or two just to poetry, and then we forget about it, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. And I think it also, we don't give enough time for children to write poetry as well. I know, obviously, in BSM where I was working, I was able and fortunate enough to be asked to use cool rhymes at school time as a base for an activity for the first week when we came back to school, and managed to get lots of activities out of it. So it doesn't have to just always be based on poetry. You can use the poem as the stimulus, and then you can have other activities which range from art or discussion, persuasive writing. I don't think it needs to be just a standalone poetry week. You can use it throughout a lot of different activities. It just needs to be promoted more.
Right. Do you think that this lack of interest or the shortage of focus on poetry could also be because it depends on how comfortable the teachers are with poetry?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that goes back to what I said before. I've never had any problems teaching children poetry because they can see that to some extent, I eat, breathe and live poetry. So there's a different level of energy and enthusiasm. I mean, one of the most rewarding things I've had as a teacher is that there's hardly been any classes that I haven't had as my own class, where literally every day children are bringing in poems for me. They're so keen for me to see their poetry because, I used to literally incorporate rhyming in just everything I said to the children as much as I could. But the whole idea was that they saw that I really love poetry, and children a lot of the time want to please you and they want that acceptance from you. So I started getting poetry from all over the school. It was just wonderful, to have that sort of engagement from children. But I think that it doesn't have to be that difficult. I think also choosing ranges of poems that are fresh and that are fun as well. I think children are more likely to relate to things that they actually understand. Hence, I wrote a poetry book about school experience, because it's things that they can all relate to, whether it's being star of the week, whether it's about, the staff room. I have a poem called The Special Room, which is obviously about children not allowed to go into the staff room. It's things they can relate to. So if you write or you have the right kind of poetry, the children will be engaged.
Yeah. And I believe you've had some students who've written poetry and given it to you as a present.
Oh, I have it all the time. There was one particular child, I won't mention any names, I remember in year 6 in BSM, who every time a lesson was if the lesson started, you did the intro, whenever the activity was starting, it was always his time to go to the bathroom. And we always noticed that he said, I need to go to the bathroom. Now, I remember after doing the poetry week, his teacher actually sent to me a poem that he decided to write. And I was so impressed with it, because this is a child that usually was quite, just not always disengaged, but he just, it was a bit more difficult to try and get him engaged in anything. And every now and again, he would see me when I would be on playground duty and be like, Miss, when are you doing another poetry week? So already you're tapping into areas of children. I'm not saying poetry would be his life's aim, but what I mean is there are areas to this child that we probably didn't even know he enjoyed poetry, but he obviously did because he was very quick to write one, which is why his teacher shared it with me. So I just think sometimes, we have to remember that we don't know what children always like, but we also have to present them with enough options to choose things that they like as well.
True. Would you like to perform a poem for us here, Sam? We have
yes,
quite a few listeners coming in.
Oh, of course. Yes. This poem I have is from Cool Rhymes at School Time, and this poem is called Strike. Now, I wrote this poem. A lot of my poems I write from inspiration from the children. I was well known in school for always having a notebook with me, writing down ideas, and mainly from observations from the children. And children sometimes moaning about being at school, which I think changed obviously with COVID. Lots of children stopped complaining about being at school, but at the time, this poem is called Strike. The day the children went on strike was a very peculiar time. They stood together to protest and refused to toe the line. They slammed down all of their pencils. They all refused to write. With placards waving in the air, they protested with all their might. They chanted loudly in unison as they boldly declared their demands. They were tired of doing schoolwork and listening to teachers' commands. The teachers tried to stop them, but the children outnumbered them all. So the teachers ran to safety and hid in the main school hall. The children felt victorious as they took control of the school. They finally got what they wanted, a day without any rules.
Thank you, Sam. That's lovely. Sam, how do you come up with the rhymes? Do you have to actively look for a rhyming word?
To be honest with you, they come to me very, very quickly. I think this is one of the only problems with me having a love of rhyming poetry is that I have to keep reminding children poetry doesn't have to rhyme all the time. It's just because otherwise what you find will happen with children is they will just rhyme the ending words of each line, and then it has no context. And that's what you don't want them to do, because then it just becomes about the rhyme, but it doesn't actually make any sense. But I do try to stress that, but children just have a tendency to love poems that rhyme. I think it's really good also for emerging readers as well, because then they can predict, what the words could be. I usually do that when I'm, sharing poems with children. They kind of get the idea and they literally can start to mouth what the next word's going to be, the next rhyming word, because it then starts to make sense. But for me, like I said, rhyming is just very easy, and I wish I could say it wasn't, but it is. So,
How long does it take, Sam, from writing a book and to the publishing stage?
If I'm honest, with this book, the Cool Rhymes at School Time was my first poetry book. I think it maybe took me about 4 months to put together. Now, by the way, I was working at the time, so I would be up, very late at night. And even if I had spare time at work, because obviously being the cover teacher, which people might think I wasn't always working, but sometimes I felt that I was probably in class more than I should have been in class, because I was always constantly in either nursery, year 6, year 3, and on days when I probably thought that I wouldn't have anyone to cover, next minute I was back in another year group. So I was able to kind of, combine any free time I was writing. At home, I was writing. So I made it work. I would say maybe 4 months for Cool Rhymes at School Time. It then took a bit longer with the illustrations, but I did the illustrations for that book myself using an app. But my actual picture books take a lot longer because I have to then wait for an illustrator and for the images to come back, and then there's a lot of editing. I would say if you want me to be really honest, when it comes to writing a poem, I can write a poem really quickly. The problem is the editing. It's something we always teach children. You don't just write something, you go back over and edit. And I'm a real teacher like that. I go back and how can I improve it? I'm going to change that rhyming word. I'm going to move that, line to over here. So I probably spend about another then 2 or 3 hours going over a poem, because then I just always want it to be better than I can see it at the first stage, which I think is something children probably don't see. They probably think, a book has been written and then that was it. And it's like, no, there's a lot of editing, evaluating, going back over it again. So I think that would be, very important for children to realize things just don't happen instantly.
Yeah. Have you ever considered, or have you ever done an editing of your poem live with the children?
Now, that
So
would be really great. No, I haven't, because obviously when I started this book, by the time I'd started this, we'd obviously gone into lockdown and online learning. And in my previous school, I was at the time when I really started to write more poetry for the children, I was the year leader as well. So my time, as I'm sure anybody else knows, in as a year leader was completely just, yeah, there was no time to do anything like that other than I had to write a poem for them to actually perform, or the children would always ask me to write poems for them for a different occasion. I mean, sometimes we would be able to write one together, and then I'd let them come up with some ideas of, well, what should that say? What should we say next? But that's something I think that could easily also be incorporated into a lesson, for example, where children could actually do it. You know, you can have a class poem and then you edit it together, which I think is really powerful.
Right. While you were speaking, you mentioned that as a supply teacher, you were in classes a lot more than you would have liked to, maybe a lot more than you thought you would be. Can you tell us a little bit about what the actual reality of being a supply teacher is?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess it's not that I would not more than I'd like to. It's just that more than what people would imagine. Because if I tell somebody I'm a supply teacher, what they're thinking is, or cover teacher, obviously a cover teacher for a specific school, not in many schools, they would just see you're just sitting around waiting until somebody else is absent. But that's actually not what my role was. I mean, for example, if people are going to meetings, someone needs to cover their class. That would be me. You know, if somebody is off, it could be for a week, they're sick, then I will go in. But then also, while I'm going into that class, when that teacher, for example, has a French lesson that maybe, for example, is, you know, taken by a specialist, I then might be needed to go to nursery to help them out for half an hour. So it's a lot more than what people think. And I actually also think only certain people can do that role. And that's not to make myself sound as if to say that I'm perfect. It's not as easy as it seems. And, you know, 1 minute you can be in year 6, then you're back in nursery. This could all be in one day, which I used to find happened a lot. But I like that because for me, it kept me busy and it kept me energized. But I also just had more chances to observe children all across the school. Hence why I was then able to write another poetry book for the younger years, which I absolutely loved.
What's that book called?
Oh, that one's called Surprise, Surprise, Rhyme, Rhyme All the Time. As you can see it right. So, of course, yeah, that was called Rhyme, Rhyme All the Time. But yeah, I just think when you tell somebody that you're a cover teacher, I do think they probably think, oh, now don't get me wrong, I will never say it's as hard as being a class teacher, because as somebody who has been a class teacher for most of my career, I don't have the planning, which obviously, you know, takes a lot of pressure off, and I don't have the parents' meetings, etc. But there, you have to be exceptionally flexible. You have to also be able to just change your voice from 1 minute being a nursery teacher, then with year 2, then up to year 6, back to year 4, then to year 2, back to year 1. But for me, I think having experience of teaching for a very long time, I found that very, very challenging to start with, because I've never been a cover teacher before. But once I got into the role, maybe I blagged it more and people all thought it was just very easy for me at first. But I really loved it. It's probably been my best job so far, because I just got to be around so many different children. I got to see the progression from year to year as well, as to, you know, where they were meant to be. Whereas when I was a class teacher, predominantly I spent a lot of my teaching career as a year 4 teacher and year 4 leader. But I also taught year 1 for a few years as well. But it was nice being the cover teacher, because I also just got to be friends with all the kids around school. So I felt like Miss Popular because everyone knew me. So
yes, especially when people come up to you and say, oh, I really like that poem, Miss. That just brightens the day, doesn't it?
Well, I tell you what really brightened my day as well. I sometimes with the younger children who wouldn't remember my name, and they'd see me and they'd say, oh, look, there's the poetry lady. So for me, that's just fantastic. That's a win-win all around.
Awesome. We have some questions coming in from Dimple. Dimple asks, what is the one thing you think should change about today's educational system?
One thing, I would say everything, but I won't go into that. What I think is lessons that are meaningful for lifelong skills. I think there's lots of things that we teach children that I don't really see the benefit of. I think a lot of our learning should be more incorporated with life skills. I'll give you an example. I think at BSM we had a community fair, and I recall, I think one of the teachers had got the children, they were selling, trying to sell on their stall BSM bags. And I took over for a while because obviously teachers needed a break, and, you know, we needed to ramp up the sales. So I literally gave the kids a bit of my kind of apprentice style kind of, come on, you need to go and sell. And they had money on them. They knew what they had to do. Now, those children were absolutely buzzing. They were running all over the place, selling bags, coming back saying, Miss, I just sold 2 for £5. I just did this and I did this, etc. Obviously, one currency. But what I meant by saying that is that they were life skills as well. Selling techniques. They've got to think about a pitch. They've got to think about the money. Can they offer a deal? There were so many things that I think if we did more activities like that, you would then probably be able to then incorporate that into a maths lesson. Whereas I think sometimes we do very standalone subjects and standalone lessons, and just watching the way those children were so enthused to sell those bags. Like I said, you would have thought it was a scene from like a junior apprentice show. It was just, I loved it and I couldn't get enough of it. Even when the teacher came back, I was like, no worries, I don't mind staying on this stall because we were having such fun. And yet the children had learned this math skills, and I don't think that that's utilized enough. Where are the relatable skills that they can then, use in their later life? I'm not saying that, some subjects hold more weight than others. I'm just saying, can we make learning a bit more fun and a bit more engaging rather than stuck to the classroom all the time? I think there are so many ways to incorporate other skills within a subject without it being straight out of a book.
Another question coming in: what do you do when you feel exhausted to teach, and how do you manage student mood and handle them well?
Exhausted to teach, I don't really think there really is an answer to that one, because I think most teachers would say they're always exhausted. I think, can I just say, as someone who's taught for a long time, one of the things that has annoyed me the most about being a teacher is the misconception that teachers all finish school when school finishes, and that we have quite a jammy job because, we have these long holidays, which, by the way, are well deserved. It's a very, until COVID and lots of online learning, I think, even parents who probably undervalued the role of a teacher, a lot of people started to realize just how in depth and just how wonderful teachers are and the amount of work that they actually do. So as to being exhausted, I don't really think there's a way you can stop that. I think planning and getting your things, in order before you go into school helps a lot. When I first started teaching, one of the things I didn't do was plan enough in advance. That makes you more tired, because if you don't have a plan, you kind of plan to fail. And I think as, you get more experienced in teaching, you realize that when I have things already, then I know that, lots of things could go wrong that week.